Okay, well, what we're going to do is I'm going to ask each of the panelists a couple of questions. Some of them sent in questions for me to ask them. Others I've I've made up questions myself, so bear with me on that. But what I would like you to do is when I've asked you your questions, if you could spend 8 minutes and 8 minutes only responding to them, that would be great, because we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A afterwards. So I'm just getting my stopwatch out, and I'm going to start with you, Sylvia. So the questions for you are this, and they relate, of course, to your background. So the first question is: do national and international large-scale assessments favor students belonging to a Western or dominant culture? Furthermore, do national and international large-scale assessments pose a risk to the development of diverse knowledge, and particularly ways of knowing, and how so? Secondly, we know that large-scale assessments offer important information for education policymakers, particularly regarding teacher training, curriculum development, and very importantly, equity. They also play a role in indicating progress towards SDG 4. How can we reconcile the need for this information with the risk of cultural domination, or put in other terms, with the need to decolonize instruments and the data that they produce? Okay, some challenging questions for you there, Sylvia. Your 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Leon. Yes, well, regarding the first question, so do I believe that large-scale assessments favor students belonging to the dominant culture? And the answer is yes, they do. When I was heading the Institute for National Assessments, we established as a condition for large-scale assessments that these should be used only for informing policy, never for consequences on individual students, teachers, or schools, and be applied to samples. Because before our time, they did have consequences on teachers and indirectly on students, and were census-based. But even when there are no consequences of large-scale assessments on students, they unjustly stigmatize students from subalternate or marginalized origins and cultures. For example, Indigenous students, they do poorly in standardized assessments, and it is difficult to transmit the message to society that this is not because they are Indigenous, but because the structure of the system is arranged in such a way that it is difficult for them to learn, both because the education they receive is not culturally relevant and is often in a language that is not their own, and also because the education that they receive is poor. Less resources are allocated to Indigenous and rural schools. Schools are poorly equipped. Teachers are not always professionals. Pedagogical support to teachers and schools is not a reality. And from the viewpoint of epistemic justice, we have to accept that there is an enormous asymmetry in the representation of the diversity of knowledge and ways of knowing in our educational system. Western neocolonial knowledge is not only dominant, but mostly invasive of educational curricula. Assessments are generally aligned to curriculum, so other knowledge is almost never included in assessments. Due to the power of schooling as the legitimizer of knowledge, the combination of curriculum and assessment is actually responsible for the loss of diversity of knowledge and of other epistemologies. The same is true of language. In my country, it is impossible for large-scale assessments to be written in the native language of those that are being assessed for many reasons. Many languages have not been documented and cannot be written. Many of those that have had not been able to reach agreements on the alphabets they should use. But the main reason is that native languages are generally not taught in schools. So Indigenous students fare worse when attempts have been made to assess them in their native tongue. Schooling has actually been one of the main causes of the loss of language and epistemic diversity, and assessment reinforces this trend. And regarding the second question, And I think that here, the first thing that I would answer is that it's difficult. It's a dilemma because we need assessment information. Since the institute that I headed was dissolved, there has been no large-scale assessment in Mexico. We have not been able to ascertain the effects of the pandemic on learning loss, and more urgently on the increase of learning gaps. We have fragmentary information that is coming from society and the academy. For example, the NGO that is a member of the PAL network has carried out citizen-led assessments in households. And my university applied the Planea test, which is the one that is comparable to the last application in 2019. And this application was made to a large population, but a population that was made up of volunteer individuals or schools in a couple of states of the Republic also. And it was carried out online during the pandemic, actually. Even when the bias, even with the bias that is involved in this voluntary response to the instruments, the results of learning loss and growing learning gaps are alarming. Policy, however, has not let itself be informed. And in my country, at least, we see nothing being done to face the effects of the pandemic, and even less so to reduce the pre-existing inequality of the educational system. And as the question says, yes, I do believe that we also need to know whether we are making progress towards SDG 4. And we are aware of the efforts made by the UIS to make national and international assessments comparable across the world in order to measure target 4.1.1. But how can we reconcile then our concern for colonial domination, epistemic injustice, and racist stigmatization of low-performing students with a need for information on learning outcomes to be able to face learning inequality? And I have to say that I have been struggling with this question for a long time because I come from a very strange combination of assessment and intercultural education. But I have posed this dilemma regarding the intersection between large-scale assessments and interculturality, or between standardized tests and attention to diversity. The question is how to address diversity through standardized testing without
undermining... I think Sylvia's frozen. I don't know, Sylvia, you can still hear us?
Yes, I can. Hello?
On in that case, and oh, Sylvia, can you hear us?
Yep, we can see and hear Sylvia. Yep,
I can hear you.
Oh,
yes?
You're back. Okay, I'm so sorry. You froze for us for a moment there.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for that.
Don't worry. Please do continue.
Okay. All right. I was saying that this dilemma that I pose is between large-scale assessments and intercultural education or attention to diversity. And because I think that addressing diversity must be understood or might be understood as tailor-made evaluation. And the problem arises when this implies not only modifying standards, but also lowering them. And this has serious implications for educational equity at a national scale. So now I pose a second dilemma. Is it possible to reconcile standardized testing with epistemic justice? And I believe the answer to both dilemmas is a complex one. On the first hand, standardized testing should not go beyond what every child needs to know. Is there a risk of colonialist bias in responding to this? That is, foundational learning and a few other things, such as those related to personal and collective preventive health measures, and of course, human rights, the knowledge about human rights and how to defend them. These, I think, every child should know. Protocols that ensure bias-free protocols and the participation of Indigenous persons in the development of the instrument are also needed. And a universal design should try to be ensured. But as I said before, this may bring us nearer to solving the question of cultural bias, but it will not solve the question of epistemic justice. This coloniality issue is beyond assessment and has to do with how to approach education in a different way. What is mainly needed is the participation of Indigenous peoples and the development of their own educational objectives for ensuring epistemic justice in the education they receive. The assessment of educational outcomes is a question to be dealt with after the first one is achieved. And just to finish, I think that we have a pending issue that has to do with how to assess intercultural education for all. And this has to do with target 4.7. And an entire discussion opens up on whether it is possible to deal with the evaluation of this whole package without a colonialist bias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. That was really, really informative and interesting. And I think you've really helped to open up the complexities in this space. And thank you also for sticking to time, despite the connectivity issues.
I'm sorry about that.
Don't worry. Okay. I'm going to hand over now to Baela. I'm going to turn to Baela, I should say. And Baela, I'm going to ask you two questions that you've sent in. One is about large-scale citizen-led assessments, which you point out emerged from the South from 2005 onwards, although you point out that the legitimacy on rigor and validity comes from the North, and the data from the South is used for concepts such as learning poverty, the World Bank, for example, and to track SDG 4.11. For how long will this unequal relationship persist? And why not just for assessments, but also remedial accelerated actions? So that's the first question for you. The second one is Schools 2030 is part of the growing movement interrogating learning as both academic and non-academic streams across 1,000 schools in 10 countries, some from the North. Do such assessment frameworks present an opportunity for decolonizing assessments concretely? Okay, there's a little bit more there in your questions, but I'll leave it at that for now because I want to give you a chance to answer rather than just listening to me read out the question. So over to you, please, Baela, when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Leon. And it has been really very stimulating listening to the keynote and Sylvia, and I hope one will do justice to this very exciting debate that we are having. I want to approach the first question because for me, as I was working on that, you know, this notion of, or the metaphors of the pyramids keep coming. And the pyramid really are from the point of view of the topic that is at hand, are really metaphors of power, of dominance, ascent of the few and exclusions of many. And whether we look at the pyramids as they emerged, the time of the pharaohs, the slaves who built those, or the pyramids during the colonial period with the imperial colonial masters at the top, and we have the subalterns using and speaking the vernacular languages only, producing the raw materials at the bottom of the pyramid. And of course, with them, the obedient subject masters also trained by the colonial masters still at the top and even in the post-independence period. Or then we have the credential view at the top of the pyramid and a very large section of the poor and the poorest who are in school, perhaps some of them in school, but still not learning, really presents a very big dilemma. And so the notion of the bottom of the pyramid comes with its own package, as Sylvia was sharing earlier also, and of this epistemic and social injustice in a very big way. And I think that aspect of the bottom of the pyramid in itself is a big concern, although our friend Dan Wagner coined it and they've been working on it. But I think that needs to be also unpacked in these in a very fundamental way. So the chronic fundamental and a foundational learning crisis, which provoked essentially in India by Pratham and Asar in 2005, the notion of citizen-led assessments, household-based, with caregivers, and to be able to look at why is it that the children are not learning? Why is it that such large numbers of children are not learning the basics, where in a very transparent way and a simple way, this could be revealed, and not just the parents and the caregivers, but also the duty bearers could see that there is a very big problem. This is, remember, chronologically 2005, and some of us started knocking on the door and saying, what's happening? What is all of this about? And of course, that is what fed into the whole reflection of the SDG 4, SDG debate and SDG 4, and also looking at, you know, the paucity or the poverty of the MDG itself. I think the whole aspect in that sense is that looking at how to see this notion of how that in countries with very rich civilizations and a huge history, how come the majority is excluded? So that whole aspect of interrogating the basics first at the household level, and how so many people from South Asia, Africa, and Latin America joined this movement to form the People's Action for Learning Network is not really about assessments only and at large scale. And when I say large scale, we're talking roughly about 1 million children being assessed, you know, between these large countries who are doing this repeatedly. So the call to action for the learning crisis is really, what do you do? And this has now morphed into a larger work, which is on foundational learning. It is wonderful to see how the initiatives and movement from the South are informing a global movement, how it's leading to its own sort of liberating or liberation, the freedom, and so much of what, you know, we heard earlier from Crane resonated so profoundly with us to see, you know, we are not trying to play to a gallery, but we are trying to look at where the tragedy strikes. And to finish off this piece is, so we see that there's a spectrum from 0 to 8 or 3 to 8 years of age, the early years, and of course, the lower primary. And it has been such a battle to fight for that SDG 4.1.1a, the lower primary, because there was a whole world against, and also, by the way, people who were doing large-scale assessments from the north to say, why are you wanting to do this? And the reason for that is that if you want to really liberate and you want to look at a tragedy which is not at the bottom of the pyramid, so that the pyramid can finally be flattened, then you need to release all those people, all those children who are there lying at the bottom of the pyramid with possibilities where they can truly be invested in for early years and for lower primary, not in silos, because as we see now, you will have early years large-scale assessments separately, lower primary or primary separate ones, but they don't speak to each other. The effort right now is what can be done with tools and with items and learning items which are culturally sensitive, yet comparable, and really they can make it, and they have made it, to a tier 1 assessment. Now, this is a very critical part because we were seen, and in 2015, when we fought for it and clinched 4.1.1a, that it was a tier 3 at that classification. Today, with UIS and all other partners who worked, including GPE, we have moved successfully to a tier 3 classification. That is now getting the validation from the north. Moving very quickly, so I think that is it's a battle, it's been a movement, and we'd like to see it in a movement mode where the decolonization project is not about just the South, but is about everyone involved in such a grand liberation. Very quickly, moving on to my second concern, that is the Schools 2030, which was...
Rafaela, sorry, you have less than a minute to,
okay.
to finish.
So Schools 2030, which was essentially about 1,000 schools in 10 countries using the human-centered design approach and holistic assessment of academic and non-academic is really a very big statement of how you can look at large-scale assessments, but on the terms of the teachers, the households, the parents, and the children. It's that co-creating of an assessment, of assessment tools, which are looking at aspects of grit and growth mindset altogether. I feel that there might be some hope in that, but we need to see how all of that emerges and how that will be validated in the space of assessments with new vocabularies and hopefully new epidemiology, and also for learning and assessments, which would be, I think, a great gift to the world. So I think we are on a good pathway. And I think this conversation and this summit has been extremely timely for the work that is to come.
Great, thanks so much, Baila. And that's absolutely fascinating. The idea of co-creating assessments, I think you've opened up a Pandora's box there, really, of possibilities. So thank you so much for that. Okay, I'd like to move on to Cesar, and I've got some questions for you, Cesar. Just to the first question relates to your role at UNESCO, where, of course, you were head of learning outcomes, and where you also played a particular role in relation to adult literacy. And I wonder, how you would go about decolonizing the concept of learning outcomes, looking back on your experience over the years. What would you do now differently? And how would you take the idea of learning outcomes down a decolonizing route now? And the second question really is similar to one of the ones that Sylvia addressed, which was, how do you find a proper balance between being sensitive to contextual and cultural difference whilst also being able to compare between countries? Okay, with those very easy questions in mind, I'm only joking. Over to you, Cesar.
No, thank you so much, Leon, and thank you so much, Moira and Radhika, for the invitation to be part of this panel. I think it's, we've been having a really interesting keynote speech, and now we're having this discussion that I really value. I learn a lot from all of you, and I'm really grateful for that. I left the UIS 10 years ago. And when I was part of the UIS, we were in the process of actually establishing an area dealing with learning outcomes. And the establishment of that area was or that division was basically related to two areas that you already mentioned: literacy assessment of the adult population and dealing with the international learning, standardized testings and the standardized assessments that we have. The first thing is that actually, we ran into a lot of discussions and a lot of problems in relation to how this field in particular was framed in the 80s and the 90s. Not every international standardized tests are born equally. They're not equals. There is a huge difference between being a research consortium with equal participation of different partners in trying to do something, and being, let's say, a governmental body trying to measure things for particular policy purposes, or being something else where you have an agenda, and you have actually not only an agenda, but actually you have a way in which you frame problems that comes from different parts. Let's say the literacy assessments, the international adult literacy assessments that we have. What we have today in the world is the PEAC assessment in the OECD, and that's basically the grandson of the International Adult Literacy Survey from the 90s, which is actually stemmed out from a youth adult literacy survey conducted in the US in the 80s. If your conceptual framework to understand reading, for instance, comes basically for studying the results of a standardized test among 17-year-olds in the US in 1983, you're going to have problems. I mean, that should be basically clear for everybody. And that's and that's basically the story of this way of framing reading. The way reading is being framed for measurement purposes in some assessments, especially in the adult literacy area, but not only there, also in PISA, comes from that. And that is absolutely problematic. And you have to deal with that. And you have to deal with that. And you have to create ways in terms of how countries that are participating in your efforts or in whatever initiative you have can contribute with other things on the one hand. But what I found particularly useful at that time was to promote something that is not usual in this area, which is to conduct in parallel to the testing part of your work, some ethnographic observation of how the test actually works. I remember we had an agreement with a colleague in University of East Anglia to do that. We did some work in Mongolia, we did some work in El Salvador, some work in Paraguay. And in this way, we said, okay, did you have this measurement which is standardized and can be useful for different purposes? And that's your second question. I will go back to that in a minute. But that's not the end of the story. You have to read this data with some additional insights that come from other methods that enrich the way you approach this. That's the first thing that we did at the time. I think that was a good idea. I think what I would do differently today is I would suggest that that's a good idea. I would try to push this harder in that direction. And the other thing that I would do differently, but I don't know if I would have been able to do differently at the time, was to deal with this heritage from the 80s and the 90s and the way we try to adjust that in some reasonable way that actually work in a very, it wasn't very successful. I mean, there were many problems and we inherited something that was too rigid, to be truly honest, to be fixing it in a more, let's say, open way, open to different ways of framing the problem. And that leads me to your second question. I mean, if I am interested in a basic issue in education, which is equity, I need to be able to perceive in some way differences among the populations. Yeah? This group is in a disadvantage because I'm measuring something or getting information on something and show those differences. That's not an easy thing, especially in literacy, in learning assessments, in anything that is standardized in a way, especially when your assumption is that, for instance, you want to measure reading not in an abstract terms, but in relation to actual everyday life. You can create a standardized test of reading in abstract terms. But once you want to make this realistic, there's no standardized real life. So then you have a major problem. So you have to be aware of that thing to begin with, that what you're trying to do is something that is essentially problematic, as Sylvia mentioned in her intervention. And that should be strong enough to make you aware of the limitation of what you are doing, and therefore call for other perspectives, other ways of looking at this, and also review the ways you are building these things. I insist, not every standardized test is born equal, okay? And that means that you have some ways of approaching education. If you approach education as a human right, and you think about equity and you think about participation, you build these things in a different way than if you are worried about, let me just give you the silly example of this. I haven't seen in my life until I started working in this area that someone believes that comparative analysis can be basically represented by a league table. Comparative analysis in even the Western tradition of comparative analysis in history, social sciences, etc., is not about rankings.
Sorry, Cesar, 1 minute.
Yeah, so we have reduced this thing for particular reasons, and we need to be able to discuss those reasons, to criticize those reasons. And the best way of doing that is basically to open this for participation from different perspectives and enrich the discussion, saying, okay, this is not just about competition and rankings, this is about understanding who is in a disadvantaged position, and especially what kind of information we can produce to make decisions that can eventually translate into improving the situation for everybody, and especially for those who are in a disadvantaged position. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's so interesting, and you know, what an interesting response to the question. Okay, right. I'm going to the last panelist, Therese Hopfenbeck. I've got some questions for you. First of all, though, please excuse me if I've mispronounced your name, and do correct me straight away if that is the case. I do apologize in advance if I have mispronounced your name.
It's all good.
I beg your pardon?
It's all good. Thank you.
It's all good. Okay. All right. Thank goodness for that. Thank you. All right. Well, before I come to your questions, can I just ask the audience, please do pop some questions in the Q&A, because I will be coming to those very shortly. As soon as Therese has finished, I will come to the questions. So the questions for you, Therese. Firstly, you've been involved with PISA for many years, right?
Yes.
From your perspective, how has it changed over the years as an assessment regime with respect to responding to cultural and epistemic diversity? So you've been there for the long haul. You've been particularly involved in developing learner questionnaires. What changes, if any, have you seen with respect to cultural and epistemic diversity? That's the first question. The second question is, how do you, as a critical intellectual, reconcile working for an assessment regime like PISA, which has been so heavily criticized by so many people over so many years, with maintaining a critical stance, a critical distance from it all? So I could ask all of you that question, but I'm going to ask you, Therese. So with those in mind, over to you.
Thank you very much, Leon, and thank you for that thought-provoking question. I'm asking myself that question many times, but I'm going to start with the first one, which might also reflect a bit of my history. When my supervisor of my PhD at the time in 1998, Professor Svein Lie at the University of Oslo, was part of the group which originally developed the frameworks behind OECD's PISA, together with scientists in Europe. As you may be aware of, it was just 32 countries which participated in PISA 2000, and they were all OECD countries. So when you're asking me how things have changed, obviously, we know from studies published by colleagues that it's been increasing amount of countries participating. And in PISA 2025, we're expecting close to 100 countries participating. And now we're not only talking about OECD's countries, and I think for me, being part of a discussion around decolonizing assessment and international studies, it's also about examining and questioning where the ideas are coming from. And OECD is behind this study, which is different if we, for instance, discuss pearls or TIMSS, because IEA have a completely different background. It was scientists who originally started that organization. And I think it's important for us that we understand what is going on by knowing what was behind the organizations. So what has happened from 2002 to 2023 is an increasing amount of countries has participated, but also they have gone from being what someone thought was probably manageable, with basically a focus upon science, reading, mathematics every 3 years. And me as a PhD student, not interested, for instance, in the ranking of countries, the aggregated score number, which was on the first page on newspapers in so many countries. A lot of people like me were interested in, for instance, the students' responses in the student questionnaire, because I was curious about how do students learn, and that we had a cross-curriculum questionnaire which asked students about their learning strategies, their self-concepts, their interest in science, their hopes for the futures, their career and hopes, and questions which obviously the press and media never cared about. But if you're looking at some of these questionnaires, there are trends which are really fascinating to look at. So I will perhaps say, and also that one reason why I've continued working with PISA is because I was interested in the instruments, and I was asked to be part of the group who could develop the instruments. So as we know, when you have the possibility to engage with people, you can also ask the critical questions. Well, one of the things I have seen is that more and more experts globally have participated. Researchers from universities globally participate in these expert groups, and there's conversation there. But as you also know from inside research, for instance, conducted by Camilla Ade, who has published recently, and also perhaps she had one article which I particularly found interesting, where she was talking about the appeal of PISA for development in Ecuador and Paraguay. I think it was published in Compare in 2020. She was looking into why that part of PISA, who's now kind of changing from the beginning, why it actually is of interest to people and countries such as Ecuador and Paraguay. And she's describing from an inside perspective, also with engaging with people involved, how PISA has this kind of narrative where you want to be a part of what OECD is creating. And I think that is something we should probably discuss also. I also wanted to mention that I've been reading a lot of critical publications. A few years ago, before I came to Melbourne, I was working in Oxford, and my team there, we had a review published in 2018, where we reviewed 654 published articles on PISA. Some of the authors are with us tonight. And one of the things which we particularly found as a result is that the dominating countries when it comes to also publishing, it is US, Australia, Germany, UK, and Ireland. So perhaps that is also something we should reflect upon when we're talking about this, and how knowledge around these studies are created, because I believe if we really want to take this seriously, we need to talk about the marginalized group. We need to think about which voices are not heard, and also discuss as researchers, who do we engage with and where do we publish, and whose voices are heard in this debate. And another thing I wanted to mention in that perspective is that you asked me, why can I be here and still engage with them? I think the key word is engagement, because when you're sitting as an expert advisor and discussing what can we do to improve instruments? Discussing whose voices will not be heard, including students' voices. That is part of the conversation. And I think that is also one reason why I continue to want to be part of groups with critical voices, as we have to be as researchers. But when I'm saying this also, like whose voices will be heard, I was thinking about the fact that we have a lot of language issues around assessment. And in my own home country, Norway, recently we didn't have very much national tests, but when national tests first were introduced, they were basically given to students in the Norwegian language. Recently, and for the first time, they were also introduced in the Sami language for the Indigenous people and students in Norway. And I think this is also things which we will bring in and should discuss, because what we measure, we give power. And no matter whether we like it or not, there needs to be a conversation about what we do next. Perhaps we should focus upon changing what we measure and changing what we're assessing. Perhaps we're not asking the right question. And I will go back to my original idea why I was interested in PISA originally. It was because I was interested in knowing more about how students are learning, their approaches to learning, their interest in science, what they wanted for the future. If we're now looking into some empirical studies around what students actually want, we do know that they need and want hope for the future. And perhaps thinking back to the keynote, it was discussed, for instance, we're living in a world of crisis. I actually gave a keynote in 2019 before the COVID, which was called Assessment and Technology in a World in Crisis. We had just had bushfires in Australia. The ice was melting. And sometimes I do wonder, could we think differently around these assessment studies and actually think about, are we asking the right questions? Perhaps together we should measure something else. And that we could do in collaboration with everyone. And a final point, I would like to mention an article published by Taylor Hewson in 2022, the OECD and Epistemic Decolonization, Globalization Visions for Knowledge in the Learning Compass. And he is talking about the need for a dialogue between different knowledge systems, not maintaining the dominance of some over others, but perhaps bring together indigenous knowledge and Western society as an example. So I'll leave you with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that very rich and thought-provoking contribution, Therese. It's much appreciated. Okay, I have some questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to start off with one that's for César, and it's from Laura Morley, and she's saying, thank you for this. I'd love to hear more from César, if I may ask, about that rigidity and heritage of the assessment framework you inherited and the kind of problems that arose from its having been developed with a specific population of US teenagers in the 1980s. So I think she'd like you, César, to expand a little bit on that point. Why is it problematic for you?
Okay, let me give you an example or an illustration that probably is a better way of addressing this question. Imagine that you want to measure numeracy, this ability to manage quantities and operations with quantities. 80% of your items in your tests are related to prices and market operations. If you just simply reduce numeracy to that thing, you are in trouble, because managing quantities, proportions, ratios, that goes well beyond economic transactions and monetary-based transactions. That's just an illustration of the problem. And that illustration comes with the second point, or with a second element attached to it. What are the kind of things that are monetized in your country, and what are the kind of things that are not monetized in my country? I mean, probably in my own context, it's absolutely unbelievable that someone has to pay for running water, for instance, right? So if you create an item that is based on the fees that you have to pay for the water that you get at home, and that's not the way you have a provision of water, and you're in trouble. I mean, in terms of the meaningfulness of your item, the meaningfulness of the thing that you are presenting to individuals. Actually, this is not new in this field. Alexander Luria and Vygotsky in the late 20s, early 30s designed and study a psychological study of the population in Uzbekistan. They want to know if the way of thinking of this population, who was basically nomadic, illiterate, etc., were differently than from industrialized Soviet Union at the moment that was in the process of becoming an industrial country. And what Luria found, and he wrote clearly about that, is that these standardized psychometric tests that we have developed in this culture do not work here. We have to do something else. I mean, this is not new in the literature. I mean, we know that. So it's a question of really having the political discussion about what is what you want to measure and why you want to measure that. I mean, which is a political thing in terms of what is the intention behind this. And I guess in the end of the day, that's it. I mean, if many people criticizes PISA, for instance, is because there is a very, actually not, I don't want to exaggerate this, okay? There is a narrow view of a narrow understanding of education, which is human capital theory. Human capital theory is like this, and the way PISA addresses it is like this. And that's the origin of having rankings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the point. I mean, it's a narrow view of things, that is an ideological, political view of things, that it's in the end the discussion that we have to have.
Thank you very much indeed, Cesar, for that comprehensive response. Okay, I've got a specific question for, and Laura's thanking you as well, by the way. But I've got a specific question for Therese now, relating to the MGSE's new metrics for success. And the questioner wonders, to what extent do Aboriginal communities in Australia, to what extent were they considered in the conversations, and how their knowledge is reflected or is embedded in the metrics? So that's one for you, Therese.
I thank you very much for that question. I think I have to say that I'm not working with new metrics. That is a colleague of mine who's working on Sandra Milligan. She is leading something called Melbourne Assessment, which is a social enterprise. So I'm leading as the Assessment and Evaluation Research Center. So I'm afraid I don't know that response to that question.
Okay, well, that's good, but at least the questioner knows who to write to if she does want a response. So thank you for that. All right, I've got a couple of questions here that I'm going to ask Sylvia and Baela to respond to. They're both to do with intersectionality. So I'll just ask them. One is that basically both of them are getting at the issue of, well, we're talking about decolonizing assessment, but what about other kinds of exclusion and marginalization? Like, for example, learners with disabilities in one of the questions, and in another question about caste. How does this discussion of decolonizing large-scale assessments intersect with these concerns around disability and caste and other kinds of social and epistemic exclusion? Who would like to answer that? Baela, would you like to come in? Please do.
So Leon, since you asked, my pronunciation is Baela, just like B-A-Y-L-A.
I do apologize. Please forgive.
Not at all. But just to highlight, so ITA in Pakistan, as part of the larger movement, has been looking at disability since 2014. And what we've done is, for at least, so we have the child functioning module already as a part of the citizen-led assessment. And we have our tools already translated in Braille and in Pakistan Sign Language. This has been a very important part of the work, and I'm very pleased to say that Sight Savers in Pakistan and other organizations have also become a part of it, and we are reporting on disability now. So that's very much now integrated. The second part is that I think from India, Pakistan, anywhere, wherever the citizen-led assessments are taking place, remember they are household-based. And now, of course, they are totally school-based as well, if you want to use them, but their primary value of this is household-based. So we are actually assessing all children. And there is no question of excluding castes. There's no question. In fact, the way the data is analyzed, we do have those disaggregations and nuanced interpretations of data so that we can further interpret that in terms of both income and other kinds of exclusion. So that can be that can also be ensured that we are not in any way trying to be inequitable and exclusionary. So I think that's the great power of it, that it is such an equalizer, such an equalizer.
Thank you for that. Okay, Sylvia, I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Yes, well, I would like to say that I think there is a mismatch between what education has advanced and what assessment is able to do. No? Because I think, for example, right now, we are very clear that education has to address diversity. No? It's like an ethical imperative, no, in education. It should also be an assessment, but in assessment, we don't have the technical development necessary to deal with diversity. I think there we have a mismatch, which is very, very important, and which leads me to the conclusion that it is impossible to reconcile standardized tests with this need to attend to diversity. For example, regarding children with disability. Now, what we have, because when I was in the Institute, we also tried to do that, and we have like two ways of attending to that capacity diversity. No? One is universal design, which I think is important, and I think we should try to do that, and Bela has dealt with that also. And the other one is accommodations, no? How to accommodate the possibility of being assessed to the different needs of the child. No? But those are the only two. And actually what that allows us to do is to give relevant feedback to the child, no? But it doesn't allow us to compare what the child is actually learning with what other children are learning, and therefore to be able to take policy measures to avoid inequities. No? So I think there we have a very, very important problem. And regarding the question on caste, I think that is very important because we know that intersectionality leads us to understand that there are many oppressions that some people are subject to, no? And that leads to the way we interpret the results of assessments. And I think that is very important. Of course, I agree with Bela. We cannot exclude anybody for that reason, no? And I think that citizen-led assessments are not excluding anybody because they are household-based. So when you are dealing with assessments in the school, you are excluding all of those that are not in school. And in this case, you are not, no? You are including them too. So, and I think that is very important. But I think that it does give us this intersectionality approach, gives us an idea of how we have to interpret the results. But I believe that we have a technical difficulty, and that is what puts assessment in such a crisis right now, because education is much faster than assessment.
Okay, we're nearly at the end of our session, so I'm going to take the liberty of asking my own question now. And I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to respond in 30 seconds, because that really is all we have time for. So starting with Bela, because I can see you first on my screen, Bela. But what do you see as the key priorities, the key priority in terms of decolonizing assessment in the next 10 years? And if everyone could answer that, that would be great. So over to you, Bela.
Yes, I think one of the key priorities is going to be how you are going to engage with all those other aspects which form the world of the child, And currently, we are still looking at alignments of textbooks and student learning outcomes, as the alignment. And we are not still being able to take into account the culture, the language, and all of those aspects. We need to do far more work on that and far more boldly. Right now, we are still playing to the gallery because we want validation of what we are doing. And so because of that, we are not paying attention to the world of the child and how the child learns.
Thank you, Bela. Cesar.
Not sure exactly in which direction I should insist, but I probably agree with what Sylvia said in terms of a sort of incompatibility that we have to live with, in terms of being aware that there are some limitations that are innate to the nature of what but belong to the nature of what we're doing. So probably my final word is basically we need to insist in the political nature of assessments, in terms of they are not technicalities that are there because they are just there. We want to do things for given some intentions, and we have to be explicit about that and read the things that we do from those intentions and be clear about those. I mean, what kind of intentions we espouse, what kind of intentions we are not ready to espouse. That would
Thank
be,
you,
I guess,
Cesar.
my final.
Thank you very much. Therese.
So one of the research programs in the Assessment, Evaluation and Research Center is actually tackling how we will work with artificial intelligence and measurements in the future. And that research program is led by Associate Professor Josh McRae. And one of the biggest issues there is ethics. There are huge promises, so I'm actually very optimistic, but it can only succeed if we're doing this in collaboration with those who are being assessed, the students, and also agreeing upon the ethics for the next 10 years.
Thank you. And last but not least, Sylvia.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that one of the things that we have to do is to downscale the importance we give to international large-scale assessments and even to national large-scale assessments. I think they are necessary. We need them to be able to see if we are making progress towards SDG 4, and especially at the national level, we need them to assess equity in learning, which I think is very important. But I think we have to downscale the use, and we have to be very much aware that what we can ask about is only that which is really truly universal, and that has to do with, I think, foundational learning. So I think that is one of the things we do. And then on the opposite side, I think that we have to give the right to every child to be evaluated and given feedback on their own progress in learning. And I think we have to work with teachers to be able to make them capable of doing formative evaluation much more than they are doing now.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Well, that's marvelous. There are many more questions in the chat, but we're out of time. Can I take this opportunity, please, to thank our panelists most sincerely from the bottom of my heart for your wonderful contributions this afternoon. You've really opened a window for me to a very large world out there, and a very important world as well. And you've posed some important questions for us all to consider. Thank you also to the audience for your wonderful questions. Okay, back over to NORRAG now.